Your Honor, Mr. Fitzpatrick, Ms. Garvey, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I also want to take a moment here before I begin my opening to thank you for putting in your time, your effort, and your attention through jury selection this morning. I want to thank you for being willing to give your time to hear this case. Most of the time when I talk to my friends about being a lawyer, they talk about jury duty, and they talk about how they can't believe anybody wants to do jury duty. And what I have found is exactly the opposite, that juries that I've talked to and juries that I have practiced in front of, they relish the experience. And I hope that you will relish this experience as well. Now, I'm going to ask you for a few things. Now, I know you're going to do a fantastic job. That's why we picked you. If we didn't think you were going to do the job or that you weren't up to the job, you wouldn't be here today. But it bears reminding a couple of things. First, I'm going to ask you for the same thing that Mr. Fitzpatrick has asked you for probably a dozen times. Be fair. Keep an open mind. Be fair. That's all we want. Now, fair means that the prosecution has to prove all of the elements of these crimes, and they have to prove them all beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to prove that Stacey Castor committed these crimes, and they have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, the opening that Mr. Fitzpatrick gave, impressive, is probably the only word I can think of. Spoken to a lot of people who've tried cases against him, and they've all said the same thing. Fantastic lawyer, impressive, fantastic speaker. And no doubt I think we're all in agreement that that's the case. But as he said during his opening, what he said is not evidence in this case. It's not proof. In fact, it doesn't mean a thing. On that same token, what I'm going to say to you also isn't evidence. The opening statement, back in law school, my professor used to refer to it as a roadmap for the jury. So you're not just sort of hanging out in space wondering what's going on when you start to hear names and dates and places and see faces and hear evidence, so that you have some context to put it all in. Now, as Judge Fahey said, we don't have to make an opening. The defense doesn't have to do anything. But we've chosen to make an opening today. Why? Because we don't have anything to hide from you. We are open, and that's where we are. Now, if you remember, during voir dire, I used this sort of amusing little analogy about the bowl of soup. Okay? Now, there is nothing funny or amusing about a murder trial. There just is not. However, that analogy I used is apt. It is appropriate. What Mr. Fitzpatrick is going to do is he's going to present to you, as he said, a mountain of evidence. And I submit to you that as you hear it, keep an open mind. And you will see that the evidence does not point at Stacey Castor alone. Now, I would be disingenuous if I were to argue that none of this evidence gave anyone any reason to suspect that Stacey Castor had done anything. That would be disingenuous on my part. And I'm not going to suggest that. What I'm going to suggest is this. After you hear all of this evidence, before you sit down and take another bite of that soup, there are things you need to consider. First, opportunity. After you hear all the evidence, you're going to see that there is opportunity for actually 3 people to have been the persons who committed these crimes. You will hear that 2 of those persons are the likely suspects. But you will only hear that one of them confessed to it. And that person who confessed to it was Ashley Wallace, not Stacey Castor. Now let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about Michael Wallace, Stacey's first husband, Ashley's father. The evidence will show that Ashley was there and present and had every opportunity to do to Michael Wallace exactly what she wrote in this note. There's not going to be any evidence excluding Ashley Wallace from having done exactly what she says she did to her father in this note. You're not going to see it. Now let's move forward just a little bit. Let's talk about what happened at that hospital after Michael Wallace is dead. Mr. Fitzpatrick tells you that the evidence is going to show that Stacey Castor didn't want an autopsy. Well, the evidence is going to show that that's not the whole story. Now, when you heard it from the prosecution, they made it sound, when Stacey was discussing what had happened to her first husband, whether she was talking to a detective or talking to a friend or relative, whoever it is, when she talked about this heart attack, sounded, at least to me, like Stacey was just pulling that out of thin air and passing it off to whoever she wanted to. But the evidence is going to show that the place that evidence came from was the doctors who treated Michael Wallace. Stacey Castor didn't come up with the whole he died of natural causes. If the doctors had suspected foul play, do you think for one moment that an autopsy would have been performed? The evidence will show that had the doctors suspected foul play, or that it was anything other than natural causes, an autopsy would have been performed. And frankly, we probably wouldn't be here today. Now let's fast forward a little bit. Let's talk about 2005. David Castor. Now, you're going to hear an awful lot about Stacey Castor and David Castor. You're going to hear about what kind of people they were, or I should say what kind of person David Castor was, for better and for worse. You're also going to hear about what kind of person Stacey Castor is. And you're going to focus in, and the evidence is going to focus in, on that August in 2005. And as Mr. Fitzpatrick said, yes, that was an anniversary for David and Stacey. And did they have an argument? Yes. Now, was this the Mount St. Helens of arguments? No. It's just an argument. Same kind of argument that married people have. And it was about the children. Married people argue about children all the time. Now, you're also going to hear that over the course of that weekend, Stacey behaved exactly consistent with how an innocent person would have behaved. When you hear it from Mr. Fitzpatrick, all of what he said sounds extremely sinister. Sounds terrible. David Castor was stumbling around. Nobody thought to help him whatsoever. Well, that's not entirely true. The evidence is going to show that over the course of that weekend, excuse me, I still have that cold. The evidence will show that over that weekend, as David Castor's behavior started to become more and more unusual, she started to involve other people. Now, did she call 911? No. Why? Because she didn't know how serious the situation was. Mr. Fitzpatrick says that a friend, Michael Coleman, came over to help Stacey get David back into bed. And I expect you'll hear his testimony from that witness stand. And as Mr. Fitzpatrick said, I want you to pay attention to that testimony. Because Mike Coleman didn't see any reason to call the police or to call for an ambulance. He just thought David Castor was drunk. Sure, maybe he seemed a little bit out of it, maybe it seemed a little bit strange, but nothing that couldn't be slept off. You're also going to hear that later on that weekend, Stacey did exactly what anybody in a situation like that would do. You have an argument with your spouse. The evidence is going to show she did. The evidence will show that what she did was try to work things out, conversation-wise. The evidence will show that when that didn't work, She tried to create space to let the whole situation cool down, that argument, that dispute. Let it cool down. And the evidence will show when things got a little bit hotter, a little bit more unusual, what she did was she just decided, you know what, I'm going to go spend the night somewhere else. There's nothing unusual about that. There's nothing sinister about that. You're going to hear that after Stacey couldn't get a hold of David Castor, that she did what anybody did, because now things have just gotten too far. It's been Friday, it's been Saturday, it's been Sunday, now we're on into Monday. Things have gotten a little bit too unusual. So what does she do? She calls 911, and I expect that the prosecution will probably be playing that 911 call for you. And what does she do? She tells the police what's gone on all weekend. And what do? They ask her to meet her at the house, which she does. That's why she's sitting at the house out front when the police come, because that's what they asked her to do. The evidence is going to show that. Now, and again, nobody's going to dispute this, but the evidence will show, and I don't think anybody's going to argue this, that after the police went into that house and they got through that door, they found David Castor, and David Castor was dead. Nobody's going to argue with that. And it's a tragedy. But nothing about that photograph that you were shown, and nothing about the testimony you're going to hear will show that Stacey Castor killed him. Nothing. We hear about Stacey's fingerprints on glasses, Stacey's fingerprints on juice bottles. Well, Mr. Fitzpatrick himself says, hey, maybe she picked up a glass. Maybe she picked up that bottle. Fingerprints in your own house. You're going to hear evidence that fingerprints in your own house, they don't mean a thing. Now, interestingly enough, you'll also hear about DNA evidence. And you heard about that turkey baster Mr. Fitzpatrick went over. And I won't belabor the facts and go over it again. You heard it in great detail. But there was an antifreeze bottle, and there was a turkey baster. And there was evidence, forensic evidence, recovered from both of those items. Both of those are critical items. Neither of those items had any evidence linking Stacey Castor to having used, handled, touched them, or used them to kill David Castor. The evidence is not going to show that. This case is circumstantial. You are not going to hear from anybody who says, hey, I saw Stacey Castor pour that antifreeze. You're not going to hear from anybody who says, hey, I saw Ashley Wallace pour that antifreeze. You're not going to see a videotape of the crime. This case is guesses and theories. That's what the evidence is going to show. Now, you heard about Stacey Castor inheriting some money. Well, you're going to hear, the evidence will show, that what she inherited from Michael Wallace was an insurance policy that she had through an employer. And she'd had it for a while. It wasn't like she walked out. You're not going to hear that she walked out, called up an insurance company, and said, hey, can I get a couple of $1 million of insurance on my husband? You're not going to hear that. Why? Because the evidence is not going to show it. With David Castor, you heard about an insurance policy, and you heard about a business. The evidence is going to show that that insurance policy, that was David Castor's insurance policy. That was something he took out. That isn't something that Stacey Castor had anything to do with. As far as the business, you're going to hear testimony that the business was indebted, that the business even had judgments taken against it. You're going to hear that this estate, which was, suggested as a so-called motive here, was nothing but an indebted, complicated mess. Not the kind of thing for which you murder somebody for. Now, there was some talk about rush to judgment, not rush to judgment. Let's put all those catchwords aside. Let's just talk about what happened. The police get to this crime scene. They look at it, see David Castor dead, and they have some suspicions. Fair enough. Whether or not they rushed to judgment, didn't rush to judgment, what they did do is focus on one person, Stacey Castor. They didn't focus on anyone else. Now, the case, I don't know whether it falls off the radar or if it just sort of hangs out for a while, but the case sort of just sits there for a while. And it comes back on the radar in 2007. Now let's talk about that. So what happens in 2007? Well, the police say, we have our reasons to suspect that something's out of whack here. Something's unusual. Well, let's get this investigation going. Let's heat it up a little bit. So what do? They want to shake the trees to see what they can find. Well, what do? They get a wiretap. They tap Stacey's phones. Evidence is going to show they didn't tap Ashley's phone. They go around to Stacey's friends, some relatives. And the evidence is going to show that they start dropping hints and insinuations that Stacey killed David. And not only that, but that Stacey killed Michael too. Why? Because they want to try to see if those friends will say, yeah, I agree, Stacey probably did it. Do they go around and talk to Ashley's friends? No. Do they go around and drop hints to Ashley's friends that Ashley may have done something wrong? No. And you'll hear evidence that people they talk to pointed the finger at Ashley Wallace too. But did the police take that into account? No. They disregard it. Why? Because they made up their mind. Don't call it a rush to judgment. Call it whatever you want. But they made up their mind. They knew who they had, and that's where this investigation was going to go. And that's it. So what happens next? Well, there are conversations among the friends, family, relatives about what's going on, about Michael Wallace's body being exhumed, about all these interviews going on, about all these hints and insinuations that Stacey killed her husband. Ashley knows about those. Why? Stacey told her. Not only that, but Ashley knew that Stacey was being questioned by the police when they were being questioned. And that wasn't on the 12th or the 11th. That was days before. Ashley knew this. Because, and you will hear evidence, she called somebody from Stacey's phone. And they got that on a wiretap. And you'll hear Ashley's own words talking about her concern about her mother being down with the police being questioned. Now, at some point between that time and the 12th, at 2:37, that note is written. And we've heard conversations and talk about there are drafts of this note. And I'm not going to get into the forensics about it. I'm going to save that but we hear it from the horse's mouth, as they say, from the experts. And we'll talk about when this note could have been written, and whether there were multiple drafts, and whether it was printed, or whether it was saved. You'll hear all about that. And you'll hear that the evidence is just not as clear-cut as the people would like you to believe. Let's move ahead. Let's move ahead to that Thursday. Ashley gets up. She spent the night with her boyfriend. Most of the persons in the house leave. She's there with her mother. At some point she says, "Mom, I want to take a nap." And you're going to hear testimony that whether it was Ashley or Bree Wallace, it's not unusual for them to take naps because they worked early in the morning. So that's what she does. Now throughout the day, she doesn't come out. Do people check on her? Yes, they do. Not just Stacey, but her sister as well. And you're going to hear about how many other people were in that house. You're going to hear about how the Colemans, we already heard about Michael Coleman. You're going to hear about Danny Coleman, his wife. The two of them were there during the course of that afternoon. They don't see Bree. They don't see Ashley. They don't think anything unusual of it. You're going to hear from Bree herself. Bree's there all day. Ashley doesn't come out. Bree's boyfriend is there. He doesn't see Ashley come out. Michael Oxner, another person there. He doesn't see Ashley come out. Nobody does. Why? They figure she's just in there taking a nap, and when they all go to bed, that's all they know. Now the next morning, for lack of a better way of putting it, that's when all hell breaks loose. Bree wakes up. She finds her sister obviously in distress. There's no doubt about that. Nobody's going to argue that at all. What does she do? She calls for her mother. She calls for Mike Oxner. They both rush in frantically. Her mother makes a frantic 911 call to get the ambulance there to help her daughter. Bree discovers a note by Ashley. The note. The important note. That Exhibit 1 Mr. Fitzpatrick talked about, where she confesses to the crimes. Now, having that note in their possession, do the police suddenly say, hey, after all this time, we might have made a mistake? No, they don't do that. What they assume is that Stacey wrote that note. And when they go to the hospital, what they do is they give Ashley an opportunity. And Ashley takes that opportunity. And that opportunity is to say, no, I didn't do it. Now, is Ashley taken downtown, subjected to hours of interrogation, asked the same questions over and over and over, having any possible inconsistency, any lack of recollection of things that occurred years ago thrown up in her face? No. Why? Police didn't care to hear that. As far as they were concerned, they had their killer. It wasn't Ashley, it was Stacey. Now, when we look at the big picture of this, when all the evidence is said and done, what you're going to see and you're going to hear is that there are just certain things about this case which do not make any sense if Stacey is the killer. On the flip side of that, you will hear evidence, and when you hear it, you will say, that evidence makes sense only if Ashley Wallace is the killer. And I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to hold you to your promise, to keep an open mind and wait for our opportunity to show you these things. Again, this case, I hate to use buzzwords, but I'll use one. Spin. Fingerprints on the glass. They say it means one thing, we say it means another. DNA somewhere, they say it means one thing, we think it means another. All I'm going to ask you to do is just use your common sense, use your wisdom, use all of those things, all of those reasons why we wanted you to be this jury. Bring them to bear. Evaluate that evidence. Decide for yourself. Have the people proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Stacey Castor did it. We are the defense. We are not the prosecution. We have no burden. We don't have to prove anything. In fact, just the opposite. Anything we say they have to prove is wrong beyond a reasonable doubt. But that being said, even with no burden whatsoever, we are sure that after hearing all the witnesses, hearing all the testimony, handling exhibits, seeing evidence, hearing evidence, wiretaps, fingerprints, DNA, computer forensics, all of that, and you have a fair and full opportunity to weigh and consider that evidence, that you will decide that the wrong person is sitting in that chair. You will be convinced that Stacey is not a killer, that Stacey Castor is not guilty. Thank you.